During the Napoleonic Wars, the British helped the Portuguese royal family escape Europe and set up court in Brazil. But after the wars had finished, King John VI did not return to Portugal straight away. This is because he believed his presence in Brazil stopped any independence movements like the ones that were happening in Spanish America. Brazil was then raised to an equal partner in the empire, forming the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and the Algarves, and they had expanded Brazil by invading modern-day Uruguay in 1816. Meanwhile, Portugal was largely governed by the British, who remained there after the Napoleonic Wars under William Carr Beresford. This angered the population in Portugal and reduced Portugal to sort of a colony. So the people rebelled, and the Liberal Revolution of 1820 captured the major cities and set up a Cortes, an assembly of the nobility and important individuals. They demanded John return to Portugal, which he did so in 1822, and he promised to uphold the new constitution that they had created. He left his son Pedro to rule in his place in Brazil, but the Cortes also reduced his role as the Prince of Brazil. Brazil would not only just be made a colony again, but all provisional governments would be subordinates of Portugal, essentially breaking up Brazil, and they could only trade with Portugal once again. Plus, using the army, Jorge de Aviles had sent an ultimatum to Pedro, telling him to go back to Portugal and swear to uphold the constitution. Pedro initially agreed to do so, but many, notably José Bonifacio de Andrada, convinced him to stay. So Aviles again mutinied in early 1822. But this time thousands of civilians and police surrounded his troops, and he was deported to Portugal. Bonifacio was made a minister and mentored the young prince. But to appease the liberals, he agreed to have a constituent assembly and signed a decree calling for elections of deputies. And Bonifacio convinced Pedro to travel around the country to gain support, especially after the attempted mutinies. Pedro made it to Sao Paulo in late August 22, and there was still no major call for independence from him or Bonifacio at this point. But then he got news that the Cortes in Portugal wanted to remove all of his remaining powers and abolish all reforms his government had made so far. On hearing this in front of his guard of honour, Pedro declared independence and travelled back to Rio. That same month he took the title Emperor, but would rule according to the constitution, and Brazil separated from Portugal, ending 300 years of colonial rule. However, especially up in the north, some still remained loyal to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese still had a sizable army stationed in ports and forts like Belém, Montevideo, Salvador and São Luís. To increase the number in their armies, both nations used slaves, forced recruitment and foreign mercenaries. The Brazilians did have more men, but in the first major battle in March 1823, they were poorly equipped and promptly crushed. And when they tried to besiege Salvador, the Portuguese just sent thousands of reinforcements by sea, as they had a much larger navy. However, to build a navy, the Brazilians bought boats and recruited sailors from Britain, notably Thomas Cochrane. And when the Portuguese encountered Cochrane's fleet, they retreated into Salvador's port, instead of fighting, and were then blockaded within the city. Then, pretending that there was a huge fleet on its way, Cochrane managed to get the Portuguese in São Luís to surrender without putting up a fight, and the same happened in Belém. The blockaded Portuguese then surrendered in Salvador in July, meaning the Portuguese had surrendered all of their territory except Montevideo. Meanwhile, in Portugal, King John VI's other son Miguel led a coup and forced his father to abolish the constitution. So with Portugal descending into civil war and unable to send reinforcements, the Portuguese finally surrendered Montevideo and made peace in 1824. And in Brazil, Pedro dismissed Bonifacio, and after months of debate over the constitution, he sent troops into the Constituent Assembly and dissolved it. But the new highly centralized government angered those in the northeast, and they tried to secede and form the Confederation of the Equator a year later. Plus, in modern-day Uruguay, separatists rose up, and this triggered a war with Argentina. And Pedro would not reign for long. He abdicated the throne and travelled to Portugal to claim the throne when his father died. His young son became Emperor of Brazil, but Pedro would have to fight his brother for the crown of Portugal during the Liberal Wars.